so I won't read that separately. Most of the message last week, we looked at the parallels between two different points. First of all, the point in Genesis 6, where it says that the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And then the second point, Matthew 24, where Jesus says, for the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. In the last few years, and especially these last few weeks, it seems like the thought of Jesus' return is never very far from my thoughts. One of the signs, Jesus gave us many signs, but one of the signs that Jesus gives us is, as a sign that his return is near, that Christians will be persecuted and martyred. And I read, reports of this all the time through different ministries. I've mentioned this statistic more than once before, but there's been more Christians killed for their faith in the last century than all the other centuries combined. That should boggle our minds. To me, it's just plain bizarre that we seldom see or hear about these daily killings in other parts of the world unless we actually go looking for it. Seems like it has to do with the spirit of darkness that keeps that information hidden. Many people today are calling attention to the fact that here in the United States, the stage is being set for a more aggressive persecution of Christians than we have experienced up to this time. And as a dad and grandfather, I certainly don't relish that thought. But at the same time, I think, why should we be spared what so many others have had to endure? So Jesus tells us in Matthew 24, and at that time many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will rise up and mislead many people. And because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will become cold. And I know I'm kind of repeating myself, but I think it's important to consider the patterns of how God has worked with humanity all through history. We know that his goal is always to restore and to reconcile his creation. Especially the crown of his creation, which is humanity. And through history, as nations have turned from him to gods of their own creation, he in his mercy always gives warnings. But then when nations continue to turn their back on him, at some point he brings judgment. And as a God of love and mercy, even his discipline and judgment is also meant to be a tool to cause people to turn back to him. In his mercy, he uses judgment as his last resort. I believe that we really need to consider the fact that God has given us warnings as a nation, and that he may be ready to resort to judgment to turn us back to him. To me, it seems really timely that we're at this point in Genesis where, other than Jesus on the cross, it's the severest judgment that God has ever brought on humanity. And again, I'm doing things a little different. As I go through the message, I'll read the account of Genesis 6 and then simply pause at certain spots to add some information. But starting in chapter 6, verse 11, it says, Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked on the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth. You could say that this corruption that God talks about here is actually a fulfillment of prophecy. If you remember back in Genesis 3, God says there is going to be enmity between the seed of woman and the seed of the serpent, Satan. And at this point in Genesis, it seems like Satan seems to be winning that conflict. But again, we're pointed forward to a time in the future that it's going to look that way again, as in the days of Noah. And this is bigger than we can tackle in this sermon. But in Daniel and Revelation, we read of a coming world leader. He's called the Antichrist. He has a sidekick that's referred to as the false prophet. Now, all through history, there's been spiritual forces behind the world powers, but never more so than today. And for the stage to be set for this coming world leader, if you've studied prophecy, you know that first of all, there needs to be a centralized and a one world government. And in order for that to happen, the influence of biblical Christianity needs to be restrained and limited. And I would add to that, the United States needs to fail. In other words, the message of the gospel needs to be watered down and God needs to be reinvented. 2 Timothy 4, it says, "For the time will come when people will not tolerate sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance with their own desires. And they will turn their ears away from the truth and will turn aside to myths." And in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it says, "Before the end, apostasy will come." In other words, the church is going to renounce the true gospel, or many Christians are going to. In verse 11, it says, "They will not accept the love of the truth so as to be saved. For this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they will believe what is false." Again, all of these things are a parallel to the days of Noah. And verse 13 in chapter 6, "Then God said to Noah, 'The end of humanity has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of people, and behold, I am about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with compartments and cover it inside out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top, and put the door of the ark on the side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks." It's kind of interesting. Naval architects have studied the measurements and proportions that God gave to Noah. And it's no surprise to me, but they've found them to be perfect, to be ideal for a vessel to float on the water. The length of a cubit is a little uncertain because the measurement is from your elbow to the end of your fingers, and of course that varies for everybody. But it would be somewhere between 18 and 24 inches, and that means the length of the ark would be between 450 and 625 feet. And I always try to picture things by football fields. And this would make at least 1.5 football fields long, and possibly even over 2 football fields long. And the width would be between 75 and 104 feet, and the height would be between 45 and 63 feet. This is a big boat. And on part of the design was that it had an 18-inch window, 18 inches high, all around the ark, to let light and air in. And the ark had only one door, which will become symbolic of the fact that Jesus is the only door to salvation. At that time, that door to the ark was the only way to salvation. And then God continues in verse 17. He says, "Now behold, I myself am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which there is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kind. Of every crawling thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive." And, I'll be talking more about this later, but, people question, well, there couldn't be a boat big enough to do all this. And actually, there's evidence, that I can give to you that, in fact, it was. And then God says, "As for you, take for yourself some of every food that is edible, and gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and them." So Noah did these things according to everything that God had commanded him. So he did. So here's a lesson for us. Here's a model for us. Noah simply obeys. And that is all the more remarkable considering at this point there has never been rain on the earth. If you remember from our earlier studies, the earth is watered by heavy dews and a watery mist that comes up from the ground. Now it takes Noah 120 years to build the ark, and I think we can assume that his wife and 3 sons and their wives worked with him. Then in 1 Peter 3:20, it talks about the patience of God during those 120 years. He continues to give people a chance to turn back to him, but they don't. And today, God continues to give our nation, he continues to give our church a chance to turn back to him. But again, because of his righteous and his holy nature, there will be a day when those chances end. And then comes judgment. 2 Peter 2, it says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to the pits of darkness held for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, and if he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example of what is coming for the ungodly." But thankfully it goes on to say here that God knows how to rescue his people. His people are those that have acknowledged their sin and their need and have repented, have put their trust in the redeeming work of Jesus on the cross. Hebrews 11:7, it says, "By faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen, in reverence prepared an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness which is according to faith." Today, Jesus is our ark. And by faith, we enter into his completed work on the cross through that one and only door. And in doing that, we become an heir to his righteousness. Amen.